I'm going to try to keep you awake. It's a very tough session to speak to mainly biostatisticians, but a mixed crowd, and try to introduce ethics into it. I understand it's challenging for some of you to follow, but what I'm going to try to do is actually use some real life examples that I've come across looking at adaptive platform trials, but in the context of public health emergencies. And I'm going to try to use some of the experience that I've been exposed to in the context of reviewing emergency research during public health emergencies at the WHO, and also working with MSF as well, which reviewed quite a lot of the Ebola vaccine trials. And I'm going to try to introduce maybe a slightly provocative element of introducing an additional stopping rule for clinical trials that I proposed with colleagues several years ago, but I'm just rounding this up now and applying this to the context of public health emergencies. So, as we all know, with adaptive trials, the advantage is the adaptation. And what we do know is that there are several different adaptations that can actually be done during a trial. And you can alter the randomization ratios, you can add or drop arms, you can change your sample size, and you can, of course, stop arms early. And so the stopping rules are one of the primary adaptive mechanisms by which an adaptive platform trial operates. And we all know that, especially when you're working within a DSMB, there are usually three stopping rules that we have. And essentially, we've got a safety stopping rule, we've got a futility stopping rule, and we've got an efficacy stopping rule. And they're very good reasons why we have each of these things. And from an ethics perspective, they tie to beneficence, non-maleficence, scientific validity. I'm not going to get into that with you. But essentially, I think one of the major challenges with these stopping rules, the current acceptable stopping rules, is that they don't address broader systemic concerns, such as whether continuing a trial with marginal interventions might delay or prevent the evaluation of superior candidates. And what I'm going to try to do is just illustrate to you how different trials that I've come across in advising different foundations and also in reviewing trials brought about a really interesting set of circumstances that we perhaps should be considering an innovative new rule to stop trials. And essentially, this emerged, I'm just giving you a bit of a backstory here. This emerged many, many years ago during microbicide trials. I was doing work then with the Gates Foundation, which were the sponsor. And the Gates Foundation were in the process of sponsoring what was then known as second generation microbicides. These were used to prevent HIV. And essentially, they'd started investing in a trial, they're millions and millions of dollars. But by then, new interventions had come up, and they were third generation microbicides. And the big question was, can we actually stop the trial, not based on futility, efficacy, or what if there's no safety issues? The trial is going to carry on for another 2 or 3 more years, but we've got new generation products coming in. But there's no stopping rule for that. So we just run a trial for the next 3 years while there are better competitors out there. So essentially, that got us thinking about whether there should be a new stopping rule. So the stopping rule that we proposed then, and I'm going to try to bring this back to the issue of public health emergencies, is a fourth stopping rule called opportunity cost. So should opportunity cost be formally recognized as a stopping rule alongside efficacy, harm, or futility? So we made this argument and we tried to give examples. And I'm going to try to use a few examples here. I'll try not to focus on the microbicide because I'm trying to stick this to public health emergencies. And there have been a few in the last few years. So you'll find that, just to make this very clear, when you're stopping a trial for for opportunity costs, it's not because of the performance of the intervention. So there's no safety issues, there's no futility, and there's no efficacy issues. But you're doing this because of resources, patients, staff, funding, trial sites. These are operational issues here. And the thinking here is that, can we use our funding more judiciously and more wisely, more prudently, and reallocate that funding towards more promising agents? At this point in time, this is not a current stopping rule that trials usually follow. Usually you stop only on the basis of course, safety, efficacy, or futility. So, of course, can opportunity cost be applied to an adaptive platform trial? And the answer is yes. The ideal environment is to incorporate an opportunity cost because they're designed to run multiple arms simultaneously. You can drop arms that are less efficacious, and you, of course, can do your comparison. You can use Bayesian or frequentist adaptive algorithms that incorporate probabilistic projections to see which ones could work, which ones could not. And of course, they have centralized governance and very flexible protocols to allocate resources. So the protocols, for example, that we reviewed within the WHO system looked at, for example, the solidarity trial. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But there's several different trials that were quite flexible. You could add interventions, drop interventions, but essentially that dropping was always based on futility, efficacy, or safety. So if you introduce opportunity costs, it could impact on several adaptive elements of trials. So you'll find that the opportunity cost can act as a meta adaptation layer. It strategically manages the entire platform, but it's done in real time. And this is very, very important with public health emergencies. And we saw this happening particularly during COVID, where you had variants of concern that were different in different regions. So when we were reviewing protocols, emergency protocols, we're given 48 hours to turn the protocols around and review it and send it back for approval. So that's what happens during public health emergencies, very quick turnaround. You don't have too much time to think about this, but the interventions came to us, we reviewed them, and essentially what we had to do was to make almost real-time decisions, but at the same time, we looked at many different governance issues, which I'll come back to in a short while. But you'll find that generally, when you're looking at opportunity costs being added to efficacy, safety, and futility, it could impact on several different issues, which impacts on statisticians, on ethicists who support the trial, on a whole range of different partner organizations, data monitoring, etc. So of course, it could impact on dropping or adding an arm. I'm going to come back to that. Sample size re-estimations, that of course the statisticians would like to play with the numbers there. It's quite interesting. It could also impact on seamless transitions. So a number of the trials that we were reviewing were phase 2, phase 3 trials. And so if you drop something at a phase 2 level, it impacts on what goes through to phase 3. It also impacts on your timing and your frequency of interim analysis, because if you have opportunity costs, and this is now not based on safety or futility or efficacy, it may justify more frequent analyses during a crisis. It also impacts on global site allocation and reallocation, because during a lot of the trial sites, or the trials that I was reviewing, there were multi-country sites. And the problem was that some interventions were available in some countries, some were actually not available, but were more appropriate for other countries. Some interventions were responsive to certain subvariants, some were not. So it became quite challenging. So you'll find that opportunity cost impacts on all these considerations, and especially on response adaptive randomization. So I'm going to focus just on the last one because of the interest of time, and just show you how opportunity cost adaptations intersects and impacts on response adaptive randomization and vice versa. So of course, response adaptive randomization is an adaptation strategy that adjusts the probability of assigning new participants to different arms based on accumulating data. So you either drop the arm, you add an arm, and the goal, of course, is to minimize exposure to inferior treatments, and of course, maximize individual benefits. So this is one of the big advantages, of course, of an adaptive trial. And there are lots of ethics or ethical considerations here. But I thought I would just quickly jump to how an opportunity cost can actually impact on adaptive randomization or response adaptive randomization, or RAR. So you'll find that if you introduce a fourth element, this is how it could actually impact. It could actually delay the opportunity cost stopping, because if you have RAR and not opportunity cost, this factor doesn't come across. But if you have both of them, you'll find that the RAR shifts allocation towards more promising arm, but it doesn't stop the trial. And this was the major challenge that we had. You'll find that there still will be less efficacious interventions in there because there's no reason to stop them yet with current stopping rules. So you'll find that the arms are not stopped, they continue, just the least optimal ones are stopped. But the problem is that it's still not the best use of resources overall. So you'll find that the implication is that there's still very promising interventions that are still not yet in the trial. There's less efficacious ones that are just rolling through, but they're not yet at the point of being stopped on futility or efficacy or any of the other recognized ones, the third one. But you'll find that the RAR could slow the allocation down, but it, of course, introduces systemic inefficiency. But now I'm going to show you how, if you introduce opportunity costs, it could also override the RAR. So you'll find that if trial infrastructure is needed elsewhere, an arm might be stopped for opportunity cost, even if it's receiving a modest but improving allocation under the RAR. And RAR is what most people are more familiar with. So you'll find here that where this becomes quite important from an ethics perspective is that usually RAR is participant focused, you minimize individual risk, and opportunity cost is a systems focus. So it maximizes, theoretically anyway, gain for society because you're going to be looking at something that might be more efficacious. So you'll find that from an ethics perspective, opportunity cost introduces quite interesting ethics dilemmas because while RAR pits individual welfare and puts that quite importantly, opportunity cost looks at collective benefits. How are sponsors going to be using their resources well? Can you actually stop this if there's something better on the horizon? So you find here that if you're incorporating all four, then there needs to be some sort of decision-making framework that harmonizes these inherent tensions here. So you'll find that one option is to use RAR as a default allocation strategy, but you permit you permit the OC-based stopping rules only with transparent thresholds, and this is something that you work with statisticians. You put in place participant protections, and this is something you work with your community engagement groups to look at best ways of doing that, and of course oversight from independent ethics bodies. And there may be many different things. I'm going to come back to the governance issue here because there are many, many different mechanisms and trial structures that you could actually use here. But of course, from an ethics perspective, you need to put this into your disclosure forms and your post-stopping follow-up mechanism. I'm not going to get into that now. But I think what is important here is if you are introducing opportunity costs as a stopping rule, there are lots of governance issues that you have to take into account. So within the WHO system, a few years ago, I had to do 2 papers for them, policy papers. One was focused on what are some of the ethics issues that come up in adaptive platform trials, but also what are some of the governance considerations that come up with adaptive platform trials. And when we were reviewing adaptive platform trials, both for the WHO and also for MSF, it became quite apparent that governance was quite an important issue. There are many, many different decision-making bodies within a platform trial. For those of you not too familiar with international adaptive platform trials, you have about probably a minimum of 5 or 6 different decision-making structures within an adaptive platform trial. You'll find generally you have an intervention prioritization committee. They decide which intervention should be prioritized. If you introduce opportunity costs, they have to now consider that in terms of which ones to prioritize. You have a data and safety monitoring committee. So they become impacted because they've got to now monitor not just for safety, futility, and efficacy, but for what's on the horizon. Is there something else that could be coming up? Should we stop on that basis as well? You also have a clinical events committee. The clinical events committee looks at clinical issues that come up during a trial that usually look at safety, efficacy, or futility. And of course, you've got a whole bunch of other support organizations as well. You have a community advisory structure, data access committees, ethics support groups sometimes. All of these are governance committees here. So you'll find that if you're introducing opportunity costs, there are lots of governance issues to take into account here. You have pre-specified decision authority and processes that have to be modified. There has to be transparency and auditability in terms of how a decision's made, who made those decisions. There have to be good records and minutes, and all of those things have to be taken into account. You have to have stakeholder representation. As I said, generally you have your community groups. This was a major challenge during public health emergencies, and I think probably for those of you on working in statistics or in data monitoring, you may be less familiar, but one of the big issues in ethics during COVID was how do you do community engagement and consultation when you have lockdowns? It was just impossible to do that. So when in a fast-rolling emergency, this is one of the challenges that you have. But essentially, you'll find that you're going to have to have all these different issues looking into it being taken into account. And when you put this into the governance architecture that underpins RAR, this is something that's an additional layer that needs to be taken into account. So I'm going to give you some real world applications here now of where opportunity costs could have made a big difference, and sometimes they were considered maybe indirectly. So I'm using just examples here of high profile adaptive platform trials during public health emergencies. The term we use within the WHO is public health emergencies of international concern. That's when the WHO's Director General declares one, but sometimes there's no public health emergency of international concern, can still be a public health emergency. So recently we were reviewing Marburg virus. It wasn't declared an international health emergency, but I'm giving you some examples here of where this becomes quite important here. So you'll find that there are at least two examples I can use where an opportunity cost lens was either used informally or it could have had meaningful impact in shaping how the trial was done. And the two that I'm going to use here are basically looking at COVID-19 therapeutic trials and the Ebola vaccine trials, which MSF and WHO conducted during the 2015-2016 period. So just using COVID-19 therapeutic trials, and I'm going to use one from the UK, the therapeutics trial called Recovery. So what happened in this trial? Well, within the Recovery trial, arms like hydroxychloroquine and lopinavir, ritonavir were dropped early by June, July 2020 on futility grounds once interim analysis showed no mortality benefits. But if there was an opportunity cost element here, by mid-2020, the trial platform was saturated. For those of you who are following the trial, they were saturated with repurposed drugs of low plausibility. Now, had the Recovery trial explicitly framed an opportunity cost rule, it may have reallocated its trial infrastructure sooner. It could have focused its staff, its sites, and patients on emerging candidates like monoclonal antibodies, which came about later, or even novel antiviral agents that entered clinical trials testing a lot later. But instead, the trials continued with, relatively speaking, low efficacy products. They weren't ineffective, but they were just really low efficacy. So the benefit here would have been a faster pivot, which could have accelerated enrollment into much more promising arms much sooner. It would have reduced delays in generating high quality evidence. I'm going to use the Solidarity trial as another example here. The Solidarity trial for WHO basically looked at evaluating a whole bunch of different intervention agents like remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, leponavir, ritonavir, etc. And you'll find that essentially the futility analysis eventually led WHO to discontinue hydroxychloroquine and leponavir arms in July 2020. Now, if there was an opportunity cost element built in, with over 10,000 patients enrolled by then, you'll find that this could have actually have freed up many, many different trial sites that were using less efficacious interventions a lot sooner. So you'll find that this could have actually have brought in several new interventions, and they could have been authorized under emergency use authorizations a lot sooner. But instead, because the resources were held up by looking at several arms, these more efficacious arms were not actually taken into account. Now, the Ebola vaccine trials from 2015, 2016 are another example here. So what happened there? This was a West African outbreak. There were multiple vaccines and therapeutic interventions that were tested, and they were basically competing for very limited clinical and laboratory capacity, especially in West Africa. MSF were doing a lot of the trials because their centers were effectively the de facto standard of care in many of the settings. So this basically, I'm giving you two examples, the STRIVE trial and the PREVAIL-2 trials. So essentially multiple vaccines and therapeutics were tested. There was an informal opportunity cost because investigators informally prioritized ring vaccination designs over more traditional vaccination trials. And essentially here, the benefit was that if they had a formal opportunity cost rule, it could have been a much more systematic redirection of the resources. So you'll find here that essentially the vaccine rollout could have happened much sooner if they had actually done the trial a lot faster. So just to give you the last little bits here, I could give you more examples from COVID-19 plasma convalescent trials. There were Mpox therapeutic trials recently where I could use examples from there. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to do that. But the bottom line here is that there have been several high-stakes adaptive platform trials that were being conducted during public health emergencies. And they were very much constrained by 3 stopping rules: efficacy, safety, and futility. But essentially, just only keeping them constrained by those 3 stopping rules actually stopped much more promising interventions from being introduced a lot faster. So explicitly building in an opportunity cross criteria into the master protocol can actually free up arms, resources, funding, and of course, study participants and study populations to get much more efficacious interventions much sooner, and that are not necessarily based on futility, safety, or efficacy. So I'll stop there, just putting it out there. Thank you very much.
Very much, Jerome. A couple of questions ready. First, and then Jonathan, and then the back.
Yeah, so your fundamental premise is that you know that the new treatment is better, but obviously, if I knew that, I don't need the study. So isn't there a contradiction in this being usable in practice? Because again, if I knew that one treatment is better than another, I wouldn't have to do a study in the first place.
Well, usually they're hypotheses, because for certain, especially during COVID-19, there were lots of repurposed drugs that were coming out. A lot of anecdotal evidence was emerging. So sometimes they became formal decision-making structures of a clinical trial based on rising anecdotal evidence. So in that kind of basis, they're still, in a sense, equipoise there, because there's not genuine certainty, there's genuine uncertainty, but emerging evidence is building up. And also, I think what happened during COVID-19 was that efficacy in one setting didn't necessarily mean efficacy in another setting, because there were variants globally, and certain interventions worked in certain settings with those variants, but not with others. So that's why it was quite important that while they may be thinking that this could work, there was no certainty until it was introduced in a new trial setting.
I mean, related to that, I mean, there's also benefit in actually stopping and formally showing something doesn't work. I mean, the hydroxychloroquine is a perfect example for that, right? Yeah. I mean, obviously, one could have given up on that much, much earlier, but it was used. And so having convincing evidence that it doesn't work, I think, was essential in this case.
Yeah, there's no even debate with that. I think sometimes showing something as low efficacy or is futile is just as important as producing evidence for showing something is efficacious. So I think that when you have your stopping rules based on opportunity cost, there's no time to do this here in more detail, but there are lots of ethics considerations that you take into account, because their costs and their benefits are both. So you'll find that you may lose valuable evidence, or you may lose the opportunity to yield valuable evidence if you make a decision based on a stopping rule based on opportunity cost versus futility, etc. But I think what we're talking about here is that adding an additional rule, you need to have proper decision-making structures to make very careful decisions there. So they're not mutually exclusive, but you have a fourth stopping rule. It could actually add an important element, especially in fast-rolling public health emergencies of international concern.
Great, thanks. Super interesting. Never really thought much about this until now. This microphone is on? Okay. So I guess my question is along similar lines to the previous question. I guess in principle, it sounds very logical to have opportunity stopping rules. But then when you start thinking through exactly what it means, I start to have a lot of questions, some of which were asked in the previous question. Let me raise 2 other sort of points that don't seem to have surfaced yet. One of them is that you can imagine that there's no intervention that's universally effective in all settings. Interventions that prove to be effective in one setting, their value might be because they're more affordable, they're easy to transport, they're easier to store. Another one might be more valuable because it gets bigger impact, but there's more infrastructure, et cetera. So generally in medicine, it's useful to have multiple interventions available that may in fact vary on one index of their value, which is the degree of efficacy. So one question, the previous question was emphasizing the value of knowing something is futile or useless, and I absolutely agree with that. But also, even if you have a drug that is not as exciting as something else, at the point where you started the trial, you had a decision. This was an interesting enough hypothesis to investigate. It seems that if it was interesting at the start of the trial, even if something more exciting has come along, and again, with the footnote of the previous comment, that evidence is based on anecdote and mechanistic information, which really isn't that reliable as in terms of forecasting efficacy. So I guess that's my first sort of concern, is that you may be rolling out validating strategies that maybe are less exciting, but that could in certain settings actually end up having value. And the second question I would have is, okay, now the patients who participated in those opportunity cost arms, you're now telling them, thanks so much for being in our study. We didn't really answer the question, but we're more excited about the next questions that are coming down the line. And that's true also if you're using concurrent controls of the people in the comparator arm. So I guess, how do you sort of handle the fact that you're basically telling the people who participate in those studies that you got no information from them?
Yeah, so because of time constraints, I didn't go into a bigger issue here, but I think what I would have covered more, which I've got on future slides or on slides that I knew I wouldn't have time to cover, is that there are several ethical dimensions when they intersect. One of them is fairness to participants. And I think one of the major challenges with opportunity cost is where an arm is stopped due to external opportunity costs, participants randomized to that arm may feel betrayed or exploited, because essentially they've been recruited into the trial and their intervention may be trending very slowly upwards to a positive result, but not wildly. It's just very slowly. So you'll find here that even if their treatment was, for example, trending positive, but it's going to be pulled now, they may find that to be a problem. But I think a similar type of thing happens with futility as well, where people are in an arms, and this is something you need to explain to participants at the start, that they can be stopped based on different rules of a trial. Now, typically, many of us have reviewed informed consent forms. Very often, people are not informed that you can be stopped based on futility, safety, or efficacy. But essentially, I think if you're introducing something like an opportunity cost rule, this is something that has to be made very, very clear to study participants at start from the outset, so that there's no expectations and no misconceptions as to what they're getting involved in. So I would say I can list 6 different ethics issues here. As an ethicist, I'm listing 6, at least 6 that I've got. But essentially here, there's no time to outline them here. But I think the issue here is, especially in our current funding environment, where almost 80, by some estimates, 88% of global funding has now been pulled because of the US pullout. And when you've got very limited resources, and the other 12% of funders are going to have to now fund virtually everything, or things are not going to get funded, we have to start thinking out of the box in terms of what trials are feasible to explore, what interventions are feasible to pull or not. So, this is something that's coming from a place of, there are several ethics issues with opportunity cost, but in a current funding environment where it's almost hostile to do global health research, you've got to make very tough funding decisions. So an opportunity cost factor is very much an issue that a sponsor looks at. This is what the Gate Foundation was asking us. Can we stop sponsoring this second generation microposite product when we've got third and fourth generations coming up? So I think it's very much a sponsor issue and a scarce resource issue. But there are lots of ethics issues that I'm not even discounting, because I've got lots listed. I can read out 10 of them to you. But the bottom line is that I think we need to start thinking and trying to prospectively address those ethics issues. But given the current funding environment, we have to start giving some sort of thought. I think a lot of trials, unfortunately, are being pulled, regardless of whether there's opportunity, futility, or efficacy. They're just being pulled anyway.